Well, what can you say? Austria, Britain, and now Germany. My supply of smelling salts is now officially depleted after one of the craziest races I have seen in all my years. From the Ferrari qualifying drama to the crazy drag strip next to the final two corners, its victims included Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, Nico Hülkenberg, Kimi Räikkönen, and Carlos Sainz. I think 1 million hearts were broken and 1 million hearts were mended today. And given that this is probably the final German Grand Prix, what an encore that was. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I will promptly proceed to my reserved bed in the psychiatric ward. Welcome to the TF1 show, and I'm still in shock because I can't even compute what that race was. I'm your host, Tinus Ferreira, and I think the best way to describe myself at the moment is the hot mess that is going to try and make sense of the ridiculous world of Formula One. Now, to be honest, I'm actually not sure who finished where, since at one stage I was looking down at my phone and Lewis Hamilton went from 5th to 12th and Lance Stroll was in 2nd. And it was just all very confusing, and so I'm going to try my best, I promise, to make sense of everything that we've just witnessed over the past, 2 hours or so. But anyways, let's get into discussing this earphone tangle of a race, and let's start with the champions, Red Bull, and what a performance from Max Verstappen and Red Bull. They did everything they could, and they put themselves in a position to win this race properly, and that started, with qualifying, where they did as well. Max Verstappen basically, I think, maximized his result there, qualifying in 2nd place, which set him up perfectly for a showdown with Hamilton in what turned out to be a very, very wet and crazy race. Now, I think if you watch the race, Verstappen, similar to Austria actually, which he also won, got a very, very poor start, some horrible wheel spin, and he was overtaken by a whole host of cars. And it was actually interesting. Now, before the race, a lot of people sort of hyped up, Verstappen versus Hamilton at the front, given that I think it's sort of consensus across the paddock and across all of the sort of journalists that Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen are probably the two drivers that are best in the wet and changeable sort of conditions. And everybody was very excited about sort of seeing this potential showdown between the two of them in these conditions. And it was sort of interesting because I don't think Max Verstappen's pace in the wet was necessarily that fast. You couldn't really get past Valtteri Bottas, and Bottas is not really known for being a very good driver in the rain. And he was sort of stuck there for a bit, and Red Bull tried a few things with the strategy, tried to get him in early on a different set of tires, which I think seemed to work for him. But I think, Verstappen, he was still quick. I think that let's not take that away from him. But I think he wasn't as quick as the guy up in front. But no matter, the strategy for Max Verstappen just worked out perfectly for him. And I think Red Bull really played their part here in great execution and great planning and sort of really, really staying in control. They were making sure that Max was on the right tires at the right time. And well, I guess except for the time where they put him on the mediums, and this then meant that Max took a bit of a spin, right, sort of at during the last sector of the lap. When Hamilton and Leclerc pitted for their slick tires, they also took a bit of a spin and slided off into the gravel. But Max was the only one of the three that managed to keep his car intact. So I guess also good for him and kudos for that. And I think this result today, I think cements him really properly as one of the best drivers on the grid. He was controlled, calm. He didn't get flustered by everything that was going on around him. I think he was communicating well with his engineers and keeping the team informed of the conditions. And, it's only a week till Hungary, and we know Red Bull is very strong there. So it could be a very, very good 2 weeks for Max Verstappen potentially. And also, he's closing up in the Drivers' Championship to Valtteri Bottas. It's not that far away anymore after Bottas didn't score. So the second part of the season might actually get really interesting with the pace that Red Bull is now consistently showing, especially during the races, but even now during qualifying. So guys, I think we need to buckle up. It's gonna be a fun one. That's my prediction. And now I guess the fun is over because we need to talk about Pierre Gasly. And I think the fat lady is singing for him. I feel really bad for the guy. He, after such a promising qualifying performance yesterday, today was the last thing he needed. I was sort of really happy for him yesterday, putting the car in fourth, and he was sort of qualified very, very close behind Verstappen, which I felt was impressive. Especially after, his crash in free practice 2, he really recovered well yesterday to bounce back for qualifying. And this race was just an absolute mess for Pierre Gasly. He also had a bad start like Verstappen did, but he just wasn't able to make up the places in the race again. Every time you think he's coming back, he's sort of regained his composure. He'll make another mistake, and then he'll fall back into the pack again. And his mistake right at the end with Alex Albon was inexcusable. I think he was just over eager, and he didn't concentrate, and then he lost his front wing, and then off he went out of the race without any points. And on a weekend where again his teammate won in such a dominant and impressive way, for him to have a race like this is probably the last straw, I think, especially also after both the Toro Rosso drivers' performances. And I really do feel bad for him, and I think he's a good guy, and I also think he's a victim of getting put in a team that he was not ready for, and I think that's the complete truth. So, it's actually all Daniel Ricciardo's fault. Gasly fans can go and throw eggs at a map of Australia or something, because I think, this year has been so damaging for Pierre Gasly's career so far. You never know, he might have a brilliant race next week in Hungary. But I think, it's been bad so far this year, but I feel this has so far been the cherry on the cake. So I'm sorry, Pierre Gasly. And also now this begs the question, who can Red Bull potentially replace Gasly with? Daniel Kvyat, Alex Albon, someone else? The thing is, Red Bull could now actually have been ahead of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championships if they had a fully functioning 2 drivers, because at the moment it's just Max Verstappen collecting the points and Gasly picking up basically the scraps left by the rest. And I think Red Bull could have probably been in a much stronger position had they had Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen in the car this year still. Or even, just a more experienced driver. So from Red Bull's perspective, if you think about how they swapped out Kvyat and Verstappen in 2016, Kvyat did a much better job in the Red Bull than what Pierre Gasly is doing at the moment. So I really, really don't know how long Gasly is still going to be in that car. By Spa, probably is going to be someone else. That's my prediction. So let's see how that turns out. And now, speaking of the Toro Rosso boys, of old Alex and old Danny, what a fantastic result for Daniel Kvyat after all of his heartbreak at Red Bull. And how wonderful. Last night he became a father as well. I guess his girlfriend wasn't best pleased that he was off racing a car instead of being with her in her hour of need. But, how very exciting for him. And then also, a second place at the Grand Prix today in a Toro Rosso is just an incredible achievement for Daniel Kvyat. And I think I join everybody in the Formula One sort of world by being extremely pleased for him after all of the drama that he has gone through over the past few years at Red Bull specifically. And I think he's now in pole position to actually get back that Red Bull seat that was taken away from him in 2016, because, he's been putting in the performances. He hasn't put a foot wrong. So really well done, Daniel Kvyat. And I guess we also need to say well done to Alex Albon, who came home in 6th place, which is also really an excellent result, especially considering that before today, he has never actually driven a Formula One car in the wet, which I think is crazy to think about, and really underlines what a good achievement today was for Alex and for the Toro Rosso team in general. Given they also struggled a bit on the Saturday during qualifying, but the points are handed out on the Sunday, so great strategy for Toro Rosso, and both of their drivers kept themselves out of trouble. Right up until Pierre Gasly hit Alex Albon's rear, where my heart was a bit in my mouth, but luckily he didn't get any damage. So wonderful result for Toro Rosso, and it might just galvanize them into some more great things over the next few races. Now let's talk about their fellow Italian team, the Scuderia Ferrari. And what can you say? In F1, the one day you're out and the next day you're in. I think this was a very well calculated drive from Vettel. He stayed out of trouble when the others couldn't, and I think he bided his time and he pounced right at the end like a ninja with time management issues. And his pace, if you think about at the beginning of the race, it was actually looking pretty grim for Sebastian, where his pace was pretty bad on the intermediate tires and in the wet, and he was losing a lot of ground. If you compared him to, the front runners and even his teammates sort of running in fifth at the time. But, he stayed out of trouble. That's all you can say. And I think this is a redemptive drive for Sebastian. And could Hockenheim be the turning point in 2019 for him, similar to the way it was in 2018? Now, obviously in opposite directions, where, this might just be the ginger up the horse's bottom that Sebastian Vettel needed to get his season back on track and get the spark burning inside that helmet of his. And you never know. I think it's been a tough year for Vettel, and a result like today might just be the thing that gets him back on track and gets him a bit of that confidence back. So very, very exciting. Obviously, I think we can't say that Ferrari had a flawless weekend. I think it's far from it. Their troubles in qualifying, that was pretty grim and strange, actually, to have two completely unrelated issues on the two cars, where Vettel had some issue with his intercooler and Leclerc had an issue with his fuel pump, or the way that the fuel was supposed to flow into the engine. And that meant that Vettel started from 20th and Leclerc from 10th. And I think given their speed over the whole weekend, it was a big opportunity for them this weekend, given how fast they were over one lap specifically. And a lost opportunity for them in qualifying to be right in front and potentially stay out of trouble or make their lives a bit less complicated. And then, who knows how the race would have gone for Leclerc specifically now, and even for Vettel. It might have been a very, very positive result for Ferrari overall. But I think we can say also, in terms of the race, it's quite a good recovery for both of them from the start, where I think Leclerc was up to fourth in no time, and Vettel overtook a whole bunch of cars over the first lap, which again was impressive to see from Sebastian, who has sort of been a bit off kilter recently. And I think, for how well Sebastian's race turned out, I think we do need to, just feel for Charles Leclerc a bit. It was really, really gutting for him to have the accident. When he did, he was really driving well, and he was keeping pace with Bottas and Verstappen in front. But alas, he had an oversteering moment, and that was tickets for his day. A silver lining for him, at least, is his little brother, Arthur, won the Formula 4 race earlier in the day. So at least for the Leclerc family, they had one member of the family on the top step of the podium. Now, something interesting to me, and I think slightly out of character for Leclerc, is the way he complained about this slippery drag strip that I keep referencing. So just for those who don't know, if you look at the last two corners on the Hockenheim circuit, just past sort of the runoff area, there is another strip of tarmac, and that's basically used for drag races that are held at the track as well. And today, for some reason, after being rained on, this piece of tarmac just became incredibly slippery, and any driver that basically ended up on that little piece of road just slid off into the wall. There was no way for them to basically recover the car, and we saw this with Hamilton and with Nico Hülkenberg, and then obviously now with Charles Leclerc as well. And he was extremely critical of this little piece of drag strip after the race, saying that it's unacceptable for a Formula One race to have something like this. Now, to be honest, I think that's a bit whiny from Charles, and I like him very much, but I don't agree with his view. The point is you need to stay on the track. That's literally rule number 1 in Formula One. So you can't complain about what happened when he wasn't on the track anymore. He already made the mistake. He's supposed to pay the price. So you know what? That drag strip was there long before he came onto the scene, and that's life. And he did accept the fact that it was his mistake, but yeah, he was a bit sore about that little piece of track, and such is life, Charles. Let's move on. Hungary is next week. It's the opportunity for it to be a really good race for him next week again. So let's move on. Now let's ask ourselves, what will Ferrari take away from this weekend? I think definitely it's a weekend of lost opportunity, but that car was relatively speedy, especially over one lap, and I think that'll be encouraging for them. Just the fact that in terms of race pace at the end with Sebastian Vettel, and then also over qualifying, over one lap they really did seem to be the team to beat. So I think that's an exciting time for the Scuderia. Now, if you want to talk about a team that's not currently in an exciting time, let's talk about the team that arrived in their retro outfits and posters and new liveries, and it was just such a team of merriment earlier this weekend. And for Mercedes, oh dear, this was probably the worst weekend for them since Hamilton and Rosberg decided to drive into each other a few years ago in Spain. And, interestingly, they brought massive car upgrades this weekend, which was apparently supposed to give them 4 to 5 tenths additional sort of lap time gain. And, I wasn't sure whether this is actually the case. And if you looked at the one lap pace that they had, it didn't seem like they all of a sudden had a massive advantage over the other teams. On the contrary, I think they were probably under massive pressure from Ferrari, and if Ferrari didn't have the difficulties they had in qualifying, it might have been a much different story than what it turned out to be, with Lewis Hamilton on pole and Valtteri Bottas in third place. But I guess it's, with the crazy sort of nature of the temperatures initially, with the extremely hot conditions, and then obviously the rain during the race, it's a bit difficult at the moment to assess whether they actually would have gained anything with their car upgrades. But it's difficult to tell, and let's see maybe next week in Hungary whether they get their advantage back. Now, if we talk about their drivers, Lewis Hamilton was all sick and dreary the whole weekend. He sounded like a frog with laryngitis yesterday, and today you can see he wasn't having the best time. So I guess we need to applaud him for putting the car on pole position with a lap much faster than what his teammate was able to produce, despite his ill health. And, look, the day didn't turn out well for him, but Hamilton was mighty in the wet today again. Like the first third or so of the race, he was much faster than anyone else, including Max Verstappen, the guy that all of the pundits and the journalists and the critics were saying, they were saying that Max was going to challenge Hamilton in the wet, and he didn't. I'm sorry, but Max didn't. At one point, Lewis Hamilton, he was between a half a second and a full second faster than everybody else in the last sector alone. So I still think he's pretty much the yardstick when it comes to driving in the wet. But, after that, things got weird. Things got weird with the weather, and nobody knew what to do. Mercedes, after Leclerc, speared off into the wall, there was a safety car, and Mercedes put Hamilton on the soft, slick tires, and it was too soon, and Hamilton actually sort of pointed that out to his team just before they put him into pit, but Hamilton didn't go with his guts, and he listened to the team, and he was on the soft tires, and literally the lap after Leclerc went off. He slid off at exactly the same place, and then all hell broke loose, basically. Now, Hamilton broke his front wing, and his accident was effectively right next to the pit entry. He then was able to save the car and sort of drive across the little strip of grass between the pit entry and the actual track, but he entered the pits behind a little bollard that indicates the pit entry, and nobody is allowed to basically cut that corner, which he then ended up doing. That then meant that he got a 5-second penalty, and then compounded with all of this, by the time Hamilton arrived, at his pits, at his pit box, his team wasn't ready with anything. They didn't have tires, they didn't have a front wing. It was chaos. Everybody was running around. Everybody was freaking out. It was a circus. And after I think it was a 55-second pit stop or something, they got Hamilton's car back up and running, and then he promptly fell from first position, I think, to fifth, which is very surprising and a bit of a miracle at that stage, given how long the pit stop was. But obviously the safety car was still out for Leclerc's accident, so he lost less time relative to the others. But after that, things unraveled a bit for Hamilton. There were a few more safety cars. He was put back on the intermediates, and then he was put back on slicks, and then he spun right at the end. He was basically out of the points, and he wasn't feeling himself at that stage. And Hamilton ended up in 12th, with Bottas being Mercedes' only hope of a podium. And yeah, we all know, well, we saw how that turned out. Bottas was pretty vanilla during the race, especially in the rain. He wasn't terrible, but he wasn't great either. He was just sort of staying ahead of Verstappen and staying out of trouble. So after all of the drama with Leclerc and Hamilton and all of the safety cars, after all of the dust settled and Bottas was on the soft tyres at the end with the last few remaining laps in fourth, chasing Lance Stroll in the Racing Point, Valtteri should have overtaken Stroll for third, and he made a big mess in turn one instead, just actually like Lewis Hamilton did a bit earlier. But for Valtteri, this took him completely out of the race. He wrecked his car, and I think that's a big mistake for him. I think, sort of his role as the other Mercedes driver, if you can call him something like that, his role is given all of Hamilton's problems that he had during the race, Mercedes would have expected Bottas to score well, and he didn't. And I think it's quite often the case, if I think back a bit over the past 2 years, that it's quite often the case that Bottas isn't there to mop up when Hamilton isn't in front, or when Hamilton doesn't have his greatest weekend, which I think is problematic for him and his role in the team in future. And I think you can see afterwards that Toto Wolff was not happy with him at all. I think he was not pleased with Bottas spinning off, given all of the Hamilton drama and sort of Mercedes fudging his day a bit. I think they expected Bottas to sort of redeem the team a bit, and him spinning off, and actually Hamilton, after the Alfa Romeo penalties that I'll speak about a bit later, Hamilton ending up with 2 World Championship points versus Bottas not getting any is a bit of a low blow for Valtteri, and therefore I'm slightly worried about his future, and I hope Hungary is a blinder of a race for him. Otherwise, I think we might be greeting Valtteri Bottas at the end of the year, from his seats at Mercedes. Now, there's so many things that went on today, so I'm probably going to forget half of what happened, but I think before we, speak about all of the midfield teams, let's just light a candle of remembrance and condolences for Nico Hülkenberg, because he drove so well this whole weekend. He beat Ricciardo in qualifying, and then he was running second at one point during the race. I was, clutching at my pearls and just praying to the heavens that Nico might sneak a surprise podium today, given all of his exploits and efforts and talents. And he was so good and so fast in the rain today, and then disaster. Now, I have to say, for me personally, and I'm repeating this now for the third time, that little strip of drag race tarmac was such a curse, since it probably caused all of my favorite drivers to have a horrible time. If you think about Nico Hülkenberg, Hamilton, Leclerc, Sainz, and Kimi Raikkonen, all drivers that I really, really like. And I mean, I was going through the most watching all of them spin off at that corner. Can't believe Hamilton, Sainz, and Raikkonen were able to somehow survive all of that and continue the race. But I think they should all start a support group, over this strip of drag race tarmac, and I'll preside as chair just to make sure that that support group functions in a good and effective way. Now, Daniel Ricciardo, it's probably his weakest weekend so far, I'd say, this German Grand Prix. He wasn't really on it in qualifying, and he was also not steaming ahead along with his teammate in the race. An exhaust issue put him out of his misery, and he also thinks that they'll be better in Hungary. So let's hope that is the case for them. Now let's talk about the orange team, McLaren. A bit of a more difficult weekend for them, given how successful they were over the previous few Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz did well to get in the top 10 in qualifying. I think with a car that wasn't as fast versus the rest as what they were used to recently. So I guess we can applaud Carlos Sainz for that. Lando Norris had his weakest qualifying performance of the year, going out way earlier than what he would have expected. So that was again disappointing for the team. In the race, Lando had to retire due to engine-related issues. Sainz was going through the most. As I mentioned, he was also off almost into the wall in the last corner, and it was just chaos for him. He was way behind at some point. But, with all of the craziness going on, he still managed to come home in 5th place, which is a very, very good result for him. I mean, he's now solidly way ahead in the Formula 1.5 championship. He's definitely the best of the rest if you think about the non-top 3 teams. So well done, Carlos Sainz, despite a difficult day, still putting in the performance and somehow managing to stay out of trouble and scoring good points for the team. Talking about good points for the team, we have to talk about racing points. I mean, what an exciting weekend for Lance Stroll. First, he ends his unenviable record of going out in Q1 for the most consecutive times of the current drivers, and then he comes home in 4th place after a crazy race. Now, well done to the Racing Point strategist for putting Lance on the soft tyres at exactly the right moment when the track was drying out rapidly. I mean, Lance almost had a podium there, which is crazy to think about given how things have been going for the team recently. But it's still a fantastic performance from him. 4th place, can you believe it? And I think, again, a redemptive drive for Lance Stroll as well, given his struggles over this year so far. Now, Sergio Perez had a bit of a contrasting experience where he really did well in qualifying. He was in the top 10. I think he was probably my best qualifier of the day. I think on Twitter I listed his lap along with Verstappen and Hamilton's, and I think Hülkenberg's or Sainz's as the best ones. And he spun out early in the race. What can you say? It was probably the least memorable crash of the day, and it sort of feels like it happened seasons ago. The race, so many things happened during this race. I sort of had to remember vaguely that Sergio Perez crashed out early, sort of triggering everything that ended up happening later on. Now, I think it's encouraging for Racing Point, after bringing a big upgrade to their car this weekend, that things went this well. And I do hope for them that they can sort of continue this upward trajectory, and that this update is as effective as it seems at the moment. And if they can maintain their momentum, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how they match up against McLaren and Renault and the rest of the midfield. Now, poor Alfa Romeo. I was ready in this podcast to compliment Kimi and Antonio Giovinazzi for a very, very good performance, finishing in 7th and in 8th. After such a messy race, I was ready to tell them how impressive that was. But then, 10 minutes ago, I guess, they were found guilty of assistance, of some start assistance during the kickoff of the race. There's basically a regulation that says that drivers need to basically be able to do the formation lap and start the race completely unassisted. And there was apparently some lag between when they were engaging their clutches and when the clutch was released, or how the computer interpreted the input from the driver. That basically meant that it fell out of some threshold that the FIA had set in terms of how drivers are allowed to start the race. And they were both subsequently punished with 30 seconds added onto their time, which is the equivalent of a drive-through penalty at the end of the race, which basically meant that both Raikkonen and Antonio Giovinazzi fell out of the top 10, which is, I guess, a bit harsh. That then meant that Lewis Hamilton scored 2 points and Robert Kubica came home in 10th then, officially, according to the standings. Now, just imagine Hamilton still being able to outscore Bottas after the day that Hamilton had. I mean, just be killer for Valtteri Bottas. You know, Hamilton actually managing to extend his championship lead after a shock of a race. I mean, that's, I guess, a bit of a positive for him to take from this whole day. Now, I don't really think there's a lot of positives Haas can take from this weekend, because at the moment Grosjean is driving the car with the spec that they had in Australia, so right at the beginning of the year, and he managed to outqualify Magnussen, who was driving the car with the most recent updates, which basically meant that they have gone backwards instead of forwards, which is, I mean, not really good news. And if that doesn't tell you the story of Haas's season thus far, then I don't actually know. And in the race, exactly one exciting thing happened, where the Haas drivers again managed to drive into each other, which meant that Günther Steiner was probably bursting an artery. And I think, again, those two, having both loose cannons like Roman Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen in one team is a recipe for disaster, to be honest. And I think, again, I wouldn't be surprised if some changes are made in that team sooner rather than later, because they are masters at shooting themselves in the foot at the moment. I don't think they have feet left with the amount of foot shooting that's been happening. But anyways, Haas, yeah, really, again, not a great weekend for them. Now, guys, let's talk about Williams. Williams has an entire whole championship point. Williams has a championship point, and I can't even believe it. If that's probably, if you think about how hectic this race was, that's the craziest thing that's come out of the German Grand Prix. And also a bit ironic if you think about the fact that Robert Kubica is the one that managed to score the point in one of the very, very few instances where he actually finished ahead of George Russell. And now Robert Kubica is ahead of Russell in the championship, despite the fact that Russell outqualified Kubica. I think he hasn't been outqualified by Kubica yet, and I think he's basically, this is the second time in 11 races that he's finished behind his teammate. But whatever, Williams has a point. Can you believe it? Let's move swiftly along to the TF1 awards for the German Grand Prix, and let's cue the music. The first award is the Pastor Maldonado Award for Most Dunderheaded Deed. And ladies and gentlemen, we were spoiled for choice this week. It's a tie between Roman Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen for literally only being able to drive into each other, and Pierre Gasly for not being able to overtake a car in a competent fashion. The Lewis Hamilton #Blessed Award has to go to Sebastian Vettel for watching all of his rivals crashing out in front of him. It must have felt like Christmas in July. Then lastly, the Nico Hülkenberg Podium Award for Unluckiest Driver has to go to Nico Hülkenberg. His face after that race tells you everything you need to know about how heartbreaking his crash was. He deserved a lot more this weekend. Now, we haven't spoken about the TF1 Stats Corner yet. As always, I put up my predictions for the average qualifying time per team for the race. And can you believe it, after constantly over-predicting what times the teams will actually do, I managed to under-predict this time. So I predicted that Mercedes will on average have a qualifying time of about 1 minute 11 seconds dead, and Hamilton's pole lap was in actual fact 1:11.7, which is way slower than what I predicted. Now, interestingly, Vettel's pole lap last year was 1:11.2. So initially I thought, predicting, 1:11 dead is actually pretty in line with what we would have expected intuitively, given that on average the cars have been slightly quicker this year when compared to last year's cars. But in actual fact, it turned out that the cars were a lot slower this year than last year, which is against the trend that we've been seeing. But don't fear, ladies and gentlemen, I will not be deterred, and I will be back with my predictions for Hungary later in the week. Hopefully I can finally do a bit better. Now, the last thing I want to quickly talk about before I sign off for the week is the really, really, I think, good and pleasant news that the Netflix series Drive to Survive has firstly been renewed for a second season, and then that this year all of the teams will be featured. Now, for any of you guys that watched the first season, you'll remember that sort of each episode dealt with a different team and sort of a race that the teams were dealing with, except for Ferrari and Mercedes, who indicated that they weren't all that interested in participating in this event. But for the F1 and Netflix has now announced that both Ferrari and Mercedes have agreed to participate in the series this year. So, at the end of the year and beginning next year, it's going to be very exciting for us to see the goings on and sort of behind the scenes footage of what's actually happening in these big Formula One teams. And the best news of all is the fact that this German Grand Prix was incidentally the race that Netflix decided to film Mercedes, or basically follow the Mercedes team around. And I mean, what a weekend for Mercedes to be featured on Netflix. The biggest, most disastrous weekend they've had in a long time. And now it's all going to be documented for us in explicit and excruciating detail on Netflix at some stage, and we can all relive all of the drama and all of the heartbreak from scratch. And I think it's going to be insane to see the behind the scenes of this whole day and sort of how the team reacted to all of the disaster that befell them throughout. So something to look forward to. And I think we also need to, of course, discuss the most pressing questions that the German Grand Prix leaves us with. Has the fat lady sung over Pierre Gasly's career? Will Nico Hülkenberg ever get that dreaded podium? Will I ever be able to forgive the slippery piece of drag racing track that ruined the race of Leclerc, Hamilton and Hülkenberg? Now, at the moment, it's looking unlikely for me to forgive that strip of tarmac, but as always, much to ponder, and let's hope maybe by tomorrow or next week I feel a bit better. I now thank you for listening to this episode of the TF1 show, and please, if you do enjoy the show and if you enjoyed this episode, leave a rating, a comment, or press the subscribe button. I truly enjoyed talking to all of you on Twitter, where my handle is @TF1show, and on Instagram, where my handle is @the TF1 show. So please give me a follow and join me in discussing all of the fascinating aspects of this wonderful sport. You can find me on all of the familiar podcasting platforms, and I'll of course be back for next week's Hungarian Grand Prix. Bye.